The line between what is a ghost and what is a yokai in Japanese folklore is extremely thin. For instance, the Yuki-onna started as the ghost of a woman who died in a snowstorm. Now she is a yokai who seduces and freezes men by draining their body heat. In this video, I'll try to stick to ghosts as simply ghosts, which are bizarre enough on their own. Japanese ghosts are not always the remnants of a single person. Sometimes they're the creation of many bad deaths lumped together. Such a creature is the gashadokuro. It usually appears as a gigantic skeleton, sometimes taller than a tree or even a castle, probably depending on how many deaths created it. If many people pass at once, it's no surprise that most of them do so in fear, anger, and pain. If many warriors' bodies rot on the field without proper funeral rites, or hundreds are taken in agony by famine or plague in a short time, that's all that's required for the creation of a gashadokuro, for they are animated by the spirit's anger and resentment at their own terrible passing. These creatures roam at night, supposedly never far from the place they were created, making a gashi-gashi sound as they move. However, they can and will move very silently despite their size when they spy a potential victim. They will then slip up on the living person, grab them, crush them, and bite their heads off. Naturally, being in the condition they are in, the gashadokuro derives no actual physical benefit from this attack. It's not as if they can really eat anyone. The benefit must come from getting a little of their own back at the living, which they resent for simply being alive and not in the same state as the gashadokuro itself is. One version of the legend states that the creature is simply too powerful to be destroyed by ordinary means. The only way to get rid of one is to let it dispose of enough of the living as mentioned earlier to somewhat calm the anger and resentment animating it, to the point it can no longer exist. This can take a long time and is clearly not ideal, at least from the living people who want to remain that way standpoint. Another version of the legend gives an alternative method for the creature's creation, and that it is done deliberately. In this variant, destroying a gashadokuro can be done but is more specific to the circumstances of its creation. This story goes back to the 10th century and a provincial lord named Masakata, supposedly over a quarrel with some of his relatives about a marriage, began a rebellion against the emperor in Kyoto. There are at least two versions of what happened after that. In one account, and after some initial success, his forces were defeated and Masakata beheaded by his cousin Satomori. The victors took his head to the imperial palace in Kyoto to prove the rebel was dead and claim the rewards. Takayasha Hime, Masakata's daughter, was a powerful sorceress and used the angry spirits of those slain on the battlefield to create a gashadokuro, which she turned loose on Kyoto like Godzilla on Tokyo. The giant creature did a great deal of damage but was thwarted when someone had the bright idea to remove Masakata's head from Kyoto and take it to a small village near what is now Tokyo. Instead of transferring the threat to the new location as everyone expected, the locals prevented this by immediately treating Masakata's head as a powerful kami, worthy of veneration and prayer. His spirit was thus somewhat appeased, ending the gashadokuro. In another version of the story, Masakata's head simply flew away before it could be hauled off to Kyoto. Whether it grew wings or just took off isn't stated. Takayasha Hime in this account raised an army of yokai and gashadokuro, plus her father's surviving retainers, to avenge her father's death and continue his rebellion. She was eventually defeated by the warrior Mitsukuni, who had some knowledge of magic himself. We have to assume he used that knowledge to defeat Takayasha Hime's army, since the details on how this was done are somewhat lacking. Mitsukuni won the final battle, and so Takayasha Hime and her gashadokuro were defeated. Somehow. As for Mitsukuni, he became something of a folk hero. There's even a famous print by Kuniyoshi showing Takayasha Hime reading from a scroll to summon a gashadokuro against Mitsukuni. He was also the hero of novels and kabuki theater. This was in the Edo period, long after Mitsukuni's time. Anything featuring Mitsukuni in New Adventures at that point we can safely assume is a creation of the imagination. One of the gentler spirits of the traditional ghostly realm, and perhaps the most piteous. Her name means willow woman. She appears as a young mother holding her child in her arms. She will plead for help, but of course there's nothing you can do for her. Her story goes that one night in a storm, a young mother took shelter under a willow tree. There was little shelter to be had there, and the wind was so strong that it drove the long, flailing limbs of the willow like whips, cutting into her flesh and tangling around her arms and legs so she could not escape. She begged for help, but there was no one there to help her. Finally, the willow limbs tangled around her neck and strangled her. Now her ghost appears under willow trees at night, pleading for help and cursing the willow tree. All that said, the Yanagi-onna can still be dangerous, depending on the tradition of the location. In some accounts, she's actually the spirit of a woman who died of spurned love. In this version, she is always looking for a young man to replace the one she lost. If she finds someone she considers suitable, she can be very deadly to anyone she perceives as interfering in her new relationship. Just as a side note, there is a similar creature who also blurs the distinction between yokai and spirit, if not the spirit of a human, the Yanagi Baba. She's even more dangerous. She's the spirit of the willow tree itself. If the willow tree is young, she will appear as a beautiful young woman. If the tree is old, she will appear as a hideous old crone. In either case, she's not looking for a man to love. She's looking for a man to devour. Western folklore also advises caution around willow trees. In Japan, I would think that advice would be doubly true. The name translates as ship ghosts. They are the spirits of sailors who have drowned at sea, cannot reach the afterlife, and want nothing more than to take other sailors, their perceived comrades, down into the sea to join them. They were most likely to appear during the Bon Festival of the Dead. They are usually depicted as wearing white funeral robes, with ghostly or skeletal faces partially covered by a haitai kakushi, a triangular forehead covering depicting their ghostly status. Sometimes they appear as only their ghastly heads in vast quantities, bobbing in the sea like corks. More often, they will appear at the railing or gunwales of a ship and ask to borrow a ladle or bucket, like a neighbor asking to borrow a cup of sugar. If the sailors on board are foolish enough to grant the request, the ghosts will rapidly dip water from the sea and dump it into the boat so fast that the boat soon founders and sinks. Naturally, over time, the living sailors developed countermeasures to such ghostly attacks. The first was probably something obvious like refusing the ghost's request, but that didn't work because the ghosts were capable of joining together, much like a gashadokuro, and manifesting one giant ghost which would simply capsize the boat and sink it that way. A better option was to have ladles and buckets on hand with large holes in them so that, no matter how fast the ghosts bailed in reverse, they could not sink the boat even though the ghosts had the illusion of progress to keep them occupied while the boat sailed toward safer waters. Another method was to always have rice cakes on board and dump a few into the sea when the ghosts were first sighted. They were hungry ghosts and would often go after the cakes, leaving the ship alone. Another possible defense, though likely rare, was to have a Buddhist priest on board the vessel. He could conduct the proper rites for the dead which the ghosts had lacked at their demise, and thus send the souls of the ship ghosts back to the wheel of life and death, where they were no longer a threat. During the Bon Festival of the Dead, the danger was far greater. Sailors and fishermen were advised to stay on shore then, because there was another manifestation of the yurei that often appeared during Bon: a ghost ship. Again, like the gigantic yurei, the ghosts of the drowned sailors would collectively manifest as an actual glowing ship. This ship would attempt to ram the vessel crewed by the living. They couldn't outrun them because they were too fast. They couldn't swerve to dodge them because that inevitably led to their boat either running aground on an unseen shoal or capsizing. The only proven method, which went against all their instincts as mariners, was to stand their ground, or sea, in this case, and let the ghost boat, which had no actual substance, ram them. Once they'd passed through the ghost boat, the phantom craft would disappear, leaving the men no doubt shaken but alive. The name roughly translates as charm returner. A fuda is a type of charm or ward to keep evil spirits away. It can have calligraphed words from a sutra or the name of the Buddha, or a holy image, almost anything of a holy nature. These were often nailed up over doorways or gates, or anywhere one did not want evil spirits to enter. While sometimes identified as a yokai, the fudakeshi is all spirit and likely once human, so I'm including it here. It has all the appearance of a typical female human ghost. Long black hair, kimono, slightly translucent body fading to mist a bit below the waist. Its main desire was to remove any charms that kept evil spirits and yokai away. The catch was, as a bad spirit herself, she could not physically remove the fuda or even touch it. She had to fool some human passing by to do the deed for her. You'd think something so obvious as a ghost would not get the time of day from most folk passing by, out of fear if not common sense or caution, but the Fudakeshi could be very persuasive. She understood human greed and gullibility. She would promise money, power, almost anything the human desired, until he, and yes, it was usually a he, would do as she asked. Once the deed was accomplished, however, the human would only receive a reward of extreme misfortune or worse, no matter what the Fudakashi had promised. After all, with the fuda gone, what was there to stop her? If there's any lesson to be learned here, it must be simply this: never trust a ghost.